Everybody, Jeff Duncan alongside Josh Katzenstein coming from our NOLA.com studios in downtown New Orleans. A couple days after Fat Tuesday here in New Orleans, we're still in somewhat recovery mode. At least I am. I don't know about you. You look kind of bright and chipper today.
Well, I felt like I had the Ash Wednesday blues on Wednesday, so I feel like Thursday's time to get back after it.
Yeah, the whole city, I think, is trying to get back after it. You can see people wandering around in a daze, realizing that they've got to get back to life, back to reality. And that's what we're doing today. We're going to talk.
Wait, how's the song go?
I don't know. Why don't you sing it for us real quick?
That's all right. Go ahead.
Yeah, we want to drive our faithful viewers away, but Facebook Live, welcome once again to our, this will be somewhat of a focused show. Sometimes we don't have a topic at hand. This one will be, we're going to focus strictly on the Saints free agency plans coming up. As you all know, free agency starts next week, and the Saints are taking a deep dive in it. It's going to be especially important for the team this year because they lack a lot of draft picks. As we all know, they don't have a first-round pick this year. They only have a second-round pick. So the draft is not going to be the traditional way to involve your player procurement plan to rebuild for next season. It's not going to be through the draft very much this year because the Saints have traded most of those assets. So I think free agency is going to be big for this team. It's always important, but more so this year because I think there's some really targeted positions that the Saints have to address that I don't think they're going to be able to do it in the draft, and maybe they can handle it in trades. We'll talk a little bit about trade prospects because the Saints, of course, have been active in the trade front in the past, but this year I think trades might be a possibility as well for them to stock the roster. Let's just discuss real quick before we get into some of the questions from everyone out there. Josh, you were at Indianapolis for the Combine last week. I know you had a chance to spend some time with some of the sources up there with the team. What did you come away with that maybe you didn't know going up there about the Saints in this offseason? Or was there anything?
It's a valid question. I mean, we only got to talk to Sean Payton, on the record. Honestly, the biggest takeaway for me, it was nothing regarding how they're going to approach the roster. I got to meet their new special teams coaches, Darren Rizzi and Phil Galliano, and I was really impressed with these guys. I had actually talked to a guy who now works for a sports agent who used to play for them at Rutgers, and he was singing their praises. And then when I actually met them, they seemed like the kind of guys that you would run through a wall for. Even when they're talking to you one-on-one, just have this deep voice that makes you want to go and get after it. So I think we were both pretty skeptical about the Saints moving on from their special teams coaching staff this season after what was a really good year for that group. But it certainly seems like these guys might help them get to the next level. But in terms of what they're doing, I mean, I actually disagree. I don't know how they're going to improve the roster this offseason. I mean, they have very limited cap space, and I think they're in a really bad spot. I mean, we see Mickey Loomis do this stuff every year where he finds a way to kick the can down the road and hurts their cap space for future years. But I just don't really see at the positions they need many opportunities to bring in impact players. I mean, tight end is probably the biggest need, most glaring one. But after Jared Cook, who's already 31 years old, I mean, there's really not a guy out there who I think is actually better than Josh Hill. So I know a lot of Saints fans keep saying, oh, let's go get Jesse James. He's young, and he did this, and this. Jesse James is not that good of a player. And I think I say this, I feel like on this show, every time this comes up, and I've said it in countless articles, but when guys get to free agency, there's normally a reason. Sometimes it's because they're being paid too much and teams cut them, so they are still good players. But a lot of times it's because they're not that good. So I think the Saints are really going to struggle to find guys that are going to come in right away and help this roster. And that's part of the issue with having limited draft picks because then they'll have less of an opportunity to do that as well.
But don't you think that, say, a Jesse James, and it doesn't have to be particularly him, but don't you think that a player can come into the Saints offensive system because it's so diverse and has such a great quarterback and a great play caller that maybe they would be better for the Saints than they would for another team?
I suppose that's possible. And actually one guy I was thinking about, because I don't know if you saw Nick Boyle, the tight end for the Ravens, signed a pretty big deal. It's like a 3-year, $18 million deal, which I think probably surprised a lot of people because he's really a blocking-focused tight end, and that is a position that's going out of vogue right now. But I think Max Williams is a guy, obviously a Minnesota guy, so, I support him and want him to do well. But I think that, he's the kind of player who maybe was underutilized somewhere, and just with his skill set, could come somewhere like the Saints and do better if he's, put in a very, specific role where he could thrive.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that. I tell you, the guy that I'm intrigued by, I've always been intrigued by him, and it really has nothing to do with the offensive side of the ball, but I think Eric Weddle is somebody to watch. I've always liked him. I know the Saints have always liked him. He's a veteran player who I don't think is going to cost a lot of money. And I think at this stage of his career, he's made a ton of money. He's been a multi-time Pro Bowler. And I think at this stage, he's probably looking for a spot like New Orleans, or I could see him in New England. He'd be a perfect Patriot. So that's the one guy that I would throw out there that I think, and I haven't talked to anybody with the Saints, so I'm strictly just going by what I think would be a good fit. He could fill the Kurt Coleman role, but I think he's going to be in high demand just because of what he brings to the table as a veteran. He might be done, though. I don't know.
So I don't think Eric Weddle's done. So if for some reason he's watching this, I apologize. But
Hi, Eric.
It seems like the Saints have this required position of safety that's too old, that we're going to pay too much to come in and do less than we expect. And I feel like that's just a position you have to cut. Roman Harper was in it, right. And obviously Roman Harper, earned the opportunity to come back after he was in Carolina. But they had Kurt Coleman doing that last year, and I just think that as much as they need leadership, on the back end, I don't know that they need to go out and get a guy who's been a Pro Bowler for so long, because they will have to overpay. Like Eric Weddle is probably going to get overpaid, even though he can still play somewhere. This is a league where the teams that do well in free agency are paying for future performance as opposed to past performance. And a guy like Eric Weddle or Kurt Coleman or Roman Harper, and I'm sure there were guys before that, that the Saints, because apparently this is one of their 15 starting positions is this too old safety that we're going to pay too much.
Right.
So I think that they certainly need to add a safety, but I don't know that I would think that that would be the best way to do it.
Well, yeah. I should have made a point that they can't afford to pay anybody. So I'm thinking it's going to have to be a guy like a Kurt Coleman, who they actually paid pretty well last year.
Way too much.
Yeah, they probably
his
are going to look
agent
for something
deserves
less.
so much credit.
Yeah, they're going to have to look for something less. But I could see someone like that being an off-season acquisition that might be a little surprising to Saints fans. I think everybody's focused right now on tight end and wide receiver potentially, and I think Sean said at the Combine, offensive line depth, which kind of surprised me because I know they like Michael Ola, I know they like Cam Tom, and I think they like Will Clapp. And that's 3 interior offensive linemen, backups, so I don't know why he singled that position out.
Well, Andrus Peat is going into last year of his deal, and I'm sure we'll talk about that later. Max Unger is going into last year of his deal, and I think Pete is a guy that they know, if Teron Armstead gets hurt, he'll have to kick out to left tackle, so all of a sudden your depth on the interior, suffers a little bit. So I think offensive and defensive line are 2 places where you sort of always need to keep building depth, and same with cornerback. One thing that I did learn, is that they probably are going to try to keep Ken Crawley. I don't know to what level, but that's just a smart thing in terms of roster building. You need depth at cornerback, and Ken Crawley is a restricted free agent who, they could tender at the lowest level for $2.5 million for 1 year deal. And I think that, if you do that, then if another team comes, calling and makes him an offer sheet, the Saints don't have to match. But certainly it's within their best interest to, try to keep him for 1 year, just because he knows the system. He had 1 good year, and I think that, it's going to be hard to find someone else for that same price who's going to be able to, come in and immediately be an upgrade.
Yeah, no, I'm with you on that. I think we agree on that one. All right, let's go to some of our questions because they're already starting to stack up. If you have questions out there, just fire away to us and we'll get to it. We're going to go rapid fire here. But the first question is from Black Eye Saint, who asked about Teron Armstead. We have gotten this question a lot. People wondering if they might redo Armstead's contract, which he signed. He signed a pretty big deal a few years ago to try and make it more cap friendly for the team so they can maybe have some more flexibility with the roster this offseason. We know his injury history. If I'm Teron Armstead and his representation, I'm not redoing that contract.
Right, yeah.
So, like, he'd have to be doing them a favor, and I don't know too many players that want to reduce how much money they're being paid. So, what's your thoughts on that? I mean, I don't think he would do it unless they threatened to cut him, and I don't think they could do that either.
And he was, an All-Pro this year?
Right.
Or he was definitely a Pro Bowler, maybe second-team All-Pro. I'm blanking on it.
Definitely was a Pro Bowler.
Yeah. Mike Thomas was their only first-team All-Pro. But, I mean, they could do, just one of those, team-friendly situations where they just change his base salary into a signing bonus, and that creates cap space. But, again, they'll have to pay that next year or the year after that. And at some point, I mean, these chickens are going to come home to roost, and the Saints just have to decide that, this is going to be the year where we just stand pat and don't spend money in free. There's so many teams that just, don't go crazy in free agency. The Saints obviously aren't one of them. And obviously they've built up, this backlog of payments to certain guys that are just going to continue to haunt them. So whether they restructure Drew Brees' deal, Teron Armstead's deal, I mean, all of that would just be sort of this
shell game.
Right? Yeah, exactly. So they could do that, but if you're thinking, Teron Armstead is just going to willingly take a pay cut, then that's totally ludicrous.
Yeah, I can't see that happening. If I'm Teron Armstead and I've had all these injury problems, I'm going to try and get as much money as I can because you don't know how much longer you can play.
Right, but if he's just talking about a restructure, then that's something where the player still gets all of the money that he's owed. So that's not a big deal, except for the long-term cap effects. Second question from Black Eyed Saint. I would prefer P.J. Williams over Patrick Robinson if push came to shove. I respect the heck out of P. Robinson, but for some reason he can't stay on the field for us. All right. I mean, he suffered a freak injury against the Falcons last year because an offensive lineman rolled into his ankle. I don't think you can really judge it based on that. And I think Patrick Robinson's best year, which was with the Eagles, was way better than P.J. Williams' best year, which was with the Saints last year. So I think are already paying Patrick Robinson. You don't want to be paying two guys, and you're not going to cut Patrick Robinson. So I just think that I don't know.
Yeah, no, I mean the fact that he's a free agent, he may be in somewhat demand just because he did play well last year, and cornerbacks are hard to find.
Except he's probably going to get suspended to start the year because he got arrested for a DUI.
That's going to to hurt his market value, no doubt.
Sure.
But people will have interest in him because he did play well last year. He's a really good open field tackler. I think he's better than I thought he was.
Yep.
To be honest with you, but I agree with you. I think Patrick Robinson, there's a reason they went and signed him.
Yep.
And then you have if you have your three corners, Eli Apple, P. Rob, and Lattimore, it's better than most teams. I think it's not great, but it's at least serviceable. You go into an NFL season with those three guys. I don't think there's any doubt. All right, from Christian Boulany on Facebook, he asks, "What's the team's biggest need? Is it defensive tackle?" I don't think I would agree with that, but I do think that's a big need, right? Because we don't know Sheldon Rankins where he's at in his recovery or rehab right now.
I do think it's the biggest need just because I think it's a more important position than tight end. I think those are the two biggest for sure. And I think, you can't count on Sheldon Rankins to be healthy to begin the year. I imagine he's going to start training camp on the physically unable to play list. We'll see if he can make it back, for any of training camp or the preseason, but certainly I think that you wouldn't expect him to be 100% at the start of the year. David Onyemata is probably going to miss the start of the year with a suspension after, ordering weed to his house, allegedly. And then, Tyler Davison's a free agent right now. And I think he could actually go for more than people expect just because the impact he had in the middle of the defense last year for the number 2 ranked run defense sort of gets overlooked because he doesn't accumulate a lot of stats. I imagine the Saints will try to retain him just because they know they have a need at defensive tackle, and they'd probably rather have Davison this year than Taylor Stallworth. But certainly, even if it's just Davison, as your top guy beginning of the year, you need to address that position. And I think, they could look for someone in free agency. They could address it again in the draft. And I just think that, after what they did last year, in the interior of that defense, that's something that they need to address, as quickly as possible.
Yeah, that was an unfortunate situation, not only for the Saints, but obviously for Rankins, who was having a career year. Now he's faced with another recovery, second major injury in his brief career in the NFL, and was developing into somewhat of a leader, I think, along the defensive line. Suddenly, that is a need. We'll see what they do. Defensive tackles don't come cheap. I mean, and the Saints certainly could use one there because both their starters have questions right now. So,
all right, before we get into more questions, I just want to point out, so according to Over the Cap, the Saints have $10.3 million in cap space for 2019. There are only 6 teams with less. And then the Colts and the Jets have over $100 million in cap space. So before we go further, I just want people to know, no matter who is on your free agent wish list, there is going to be a team that can afford to pay them more than the Saints. So, that's why we're probably going to see them getting, the second-tier guys, or going for the second-tier guys, which was the case, the last couple of years, too.
right.
Larry Warford was their biggest free agent haul 2 years ago, and obviously that was a huge signing for them. And one that maybe we didn't see coming as much. And then last year was Demario Davis was their biggest, who, again, pretty decent contract for that guy, but I don't think anyone, Saints fans are going in the offseason like, oh my God, we need Demario Davis.
Right.
Again, very important signing, but I'm just saying, if, like Landon Collins, I can't imagine they're going to afford Landon Collins. It's also not a position that they need as much. So just keep that in mind as you're considering these possibilities. One guy you've mentioned that I actually think would be, a potential fit for them is Adam Humphries, the slot receiver for the Bucs. I definitely think that's a need for them. They do feel pretty confident with Kirkwood, especially based on what he did last year, and obviously they took Traquan Smith in the 3rd round, Ted Ginn's back for another year. But I just think that they're going to need another reliable weapon, besides Michael Thomas on this offense and Alvin Kamara. So I think a guy like Humphries could make sense, or they could draft a slot guy.
Yeah, I like Humphries a lot.
Yeah.
I think Humphries makes a lot of sense. How much is he going to cost? Some people were throwing on some crazy numbers for him, and we'll see if reality comes into play. I don't know. I saw speculation that he might be up around $8 to $10 million or something. That's crazy to me. I can't see that happening. He's a good player.
So that's the thing you got to remember. When the salary cap goes up by $10 million every year, a lot of these contracts get inflated because guys are becoming free agents. So it wouldn't surprise me if he got $8 million a year.
All right. Well, look, here's a couple of big name, and this is what happens this time of year. There's going to be some big name players that are either on the market or going to be on the market, or potentially in the trade market. One of those, of course, from Jacob Hawthorne, asks about Antonio Brown. He's obviously one of the biggest names that's going to be available, but he's in the trade market.
Mm-hmm.
The Steelers have his rights. They don't have to trade him at all. It's just like Anthony Davis and the Pelicans. They're going to try and get the best deal they can get. I'm not sure the Saints have the assets to acquire Antonio Brown. I think you can make a case that he would be a nice fit opposite Mike Thomas, but I think only as a short-term situation. And if I'm Antonio Brown in the Steelers, I don't see it happening here. It just doesn't make sense from their point of view. Yes, from the Saints, they might want him, but at what cost and how long? And he's going to be looking to, I think, sign with somebody and then get a long-term deal and make a ton of money. And that's what Mike Thomas is going to be doing here.
Well, I think he's already under contract for the next 3 years, and if you're getting him, in his big contract, obviously the Steelers are going to have to eat some of that money, but I don't know how you can pay Antonio Brown and Michael Thomas and then eventually Alvin Kamara and Marshawn Lattimore and Ryan Ramczyk. So I just don't think it makes sense. The only reason it would be a possibility is if the Steelers are willing to take a late 2nd round pick as the main part of that trade, but I just can't imagine that they would be, especially because it seems like there's a legitimate market out there. So we've said all along that it's highly unlikely that Antonio Brown would be an option, and I just don't see it happening.
Yeah, the only way I could see it working, and this would be rare, is the Saints got him for like a year and then traded him. Something like what the Patriots did with Brandon Cooks, where they got him for a year and moved him on and didn't have to pay him long term. That's the only way I could see it work. But the Saints, to acquire him, I don't know what assets they could give to Pittsburgh unless they gave that 2nd round pick, and that's a low 2nd round pick. I think Pittsburgh's going to get better than that for him. So I don't know. It just seems like not a great match for me. So.
I agree. I also don't know how him and Mike Thomas would get along. Those are 2 guys that want the ball every play.
Right.
And historically, those marriages haven't worked out that well. So I wouldn't get your hopes up. But there's so many Saints fans are curious about this. Antonio Brown is, one of the best players in the league. So certainly I would be shocked if the Saints haven't made the call. But obviously, we have another one from VB Saints lady saying...
That's Val. Hey, Val.
Hey, Val.
Yes.
Several of your sports writing colleagues continue to push the Antonio Brown to the Saints as a possibility. And I haven't seen this at all. I saw Mike Silver report, not to rule out the Saints or something, but other than that, I haven't seen...
Yeah, it seemed like speculation.
I haven't seen anything, legitimate, connecting those dots.
No, I mean, that's the kind of player I could definitely see Sean Payton wanting.
Right.
You know how Payton, can fall in love with a player. And we all know how well Antonio Brown played against the Saints this year. I mean, he was electric on the field. He was maybe the best player on the field. But Mickey Loomis has a salary cap situation to deal with, and they have trade assets. I think it's going to be a difficult marriage for them. But we should find out soon. The reports could happen sometime this week, right? The trade.
Yeah.
So I mean,
by Friday is what I heard the other day.
The Steelers wisely are trying to position themselves for the start of free agency. They want to get this taken care of first before they get into free agency, so they know what they have to deal with going into free agency. So we'll see. Look, I've been surprised by the Saints in the past. This one would shock me if they got him.
But I think this is, where the referendum and all of the Mickey Loomis cap issues and the Sean Payton, impulsive trades, sort of come back to bite the Saints. I mean, I said it last year when they were pursuing Ndamukong Suh. You have to keep enough money sort of in the kitty that when a once-in-a-lifetime or once-in-a-generation player comes along, you have an opportunity to add that person.
Right.
So you're telling me that last year, if the Saints had just drafted, another defensive end with the 29th pick in the draft,
right,
and they still had their first-round pick this year, then they could go out and get Antonio Brown. I think they'd be in a much better spot to win a Super Bowl.
They would have
otherwise.
But they went for it.
So I mean, and there have to be times when you go for it, but I think it's just an impulsive thing that the Saints do pretty much every year that hurts them the following year or for years to come. And that's why I continue to say that they shouldn't go out and spend big money on free agency because they don't have the money. And if they're going to pretend that they do, then they're going to hurt themselves next year. And who knows who's going to become available next year?
All right,
wait, next year, in theory, Jadeveon Clowney and Demarcus Lawrence could both be available.
Well, they're going to be huge signings.
Yeah, but I'm saying in theory, both those guys are getting franchised this year.
Right.
They could potentially be on the market. And now, obviously, the Saints are in win-now mode. They've been in win-now mode since 2006. But you would think a team that's forward-thinking, might try to save some of this money, knowing that they have a good roster as it is, and then maybe next year try to do something that would, preserve the team for years to come.
Yeah, but I mean,
I'll get down from my pedestal.
I just don't know. I mean, really, they're going to be in that market for him. They've already got Cam Jordan. They got a developmental player in Davenport. I mean, I don't see them.
I'm just saying, these kind of guys become available, and you have to give yourself a chance to add these guys on the rare chance that they do. And the Saints' just poor planning over the years has, sort of prevented them from doing so.
All right, moving on real quick because we got a bunch of questions stacking up. Again, send your questions in. We'll get to them here rapid fire fashion. Tyrann Mathieu, we've talked about this before. The Honey Badger is available. Is there a possibility? Seems remote to me. What do you think?
I'm sure there's a possibility, but I just don't know how he would fit. I mean, if you bring him in, maybe he plays the nickel, but then, that pushes Patrick Robinson back. The Saints seem to like their two starting safeties, unless, maybe they've soured on Vaughn Bell for some reason because they didn't like him his first 2 years. So Tyrann Mathieu is a perfect example of a guy who would probably cost more than they can afford, and there's not a good fit, so I wouldn't get your hopes up.
Seems remote, I think.
Yeah.
They're not going to be in the market to spend a ton of money on a safety because he's a third safety at best right now, so that's just not going to be I think Tyrann Mathieu is going to find a better deal than what the Saints are going to offer him. Max Taunton on Facebook asked about the Mark Ingram situation, which is probably the biggest issue personnel-wise facing the Saints on their current roster going forward. I'm going to have a column weighing in on this soon. I think the Saints could live without Mark Ingram, but would like to have him back at the right price. What do you think? Where do you think that's going?
So I actually do think he'll be back. I feel like my thoughts on this, have changed, increasingly toward thinking that he'll be back, since last year when we knew he was going to become a free agent. Just because I think he really wants to be back, and the Saints seem to want him back. And as much as I do expect him to have a market, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if some team offers him, $5 or $6 million a year. I just think that he knows he's probably in the best situation if he stays here, plays with Drew Brees and Alvin Kamara. And the Saints should be able to pay him, something. I'm not sure the exact number, maybe $4, to $5 million. Obviously, that would limit what they can spend elsewhere. But I just think that there are other teams. I talked to a scout from another team that said they would be interested in Ingram, but they already have a young running back that they took early in the draft last year, and pretty much every team has a good running back already. I mean, they might not be next level like Alvin Kamara, but anywhere he goes, he's not going to be the guy. He'll be sharing the load with somebody. So, from his perspective, it's probably more valuable for him to do it here, knowing that he has a chance to, get to a Super Bowl.
Yeah, I think the market for running backs that are getting ready to turn 30, which Mark Ingram is, and I know he doesn't have as much tread on the tire as most backs his age and with as much experience as he has. But the fact is, there's just not a huge market. I mean, Le'Veon Bell's seen that firsthand with the Steelers. Great talent, not a huge market for him. Okay, Damon Bowe asks about the Saints' cap space and where they can find room to free up some space. So what contracts are available maybe to be reworked? You mentioned that a little while ago. There's some players I think it starts with Drew Brees, right? I mean,
so it's Brees and Armstead would probably be the easiest ones to rework. And I haven't crunched the numbers to see how much space they could clear that way. But again, I mean, you would. I don't need to keep piling on, but I mean, you would be doing that and pushing their money into future years just so that you can sign a guy who's got a backloaded contract already. So I don't know that that's the best.
But here's where it makes sense to me. I mean, Drew Brees, whatever he has left in him, 1 year, 2 years. Once you get to the end point with him, you eat the dead money when he moves on, whether retires or whatever, and then you have to go with a young, cheap quarterback in the interim. And basically that money of the dead money for his contract is an elite quarterback contract.
Right.
If it's Taysom Hill, I'm not saying it's him, but he's still on a rookie contract or someone like that. That's the idea I think they have in mind with him. But how many more years do you keep doing that? At some point, Drew's going to move on. But I think he's got at least 1 year left in him, obviously, maybe 2. The way he played this past year, he tailed off a little bit at the end of the year. That's one spot. I mean, they could always move on from somebody, right? I mean, Andres Pete or something. If they traded him, could they free up some cap space there?
Yeah, but I mean, so...
What's the problem?
No, I keep seeing fans on Twitter say like why don't we trade AJ Klein or this person, and it's like, listen, if you want to trade a guy, then other teams probably don't want that guy. So Andres Pete, he's got like a 9.6 million, like 9 point something $1 million contract this year because of his 5th year option. Those numbers are related to the top salaried guys at the position. So Andrews can probably thank Larry Warford a little bit for that. It's just a 1 year deal that they add to the end of the rookie contract for guys that were drafted in the first round. But if the Saints don't want to pay that much for him for 1 year, I don't know why anyone else would.
Can somebody trade for him, get him in, and then rework his contract?
No.
Can't sign him long term.
But no, you could sign him. You could sign him long term, but then that's not in his best interest. I don't know why Andrus and Tom Condon would want to do a deal.
Long term security, maybe.
Yeah, but then you're limiting. I mean, a lot of guys want to get to free agency. Obviously, there's security in having a long term deal.
Right.
But when you're being paid $9 million this year, if you play well again, then you're going to argue that you deserve more than $9 million for the next few years. So I just don't see why it would be in his interest. And sure, there's a chance that the Saints could trade him and that a team would be willing to guarantee him a long-term deal. But if the Saints aren't willing to do that, I don't know why other teams would be.
All right, question from Brian Riles on Facebook. Should the Saints go after LSU tight end Foster Moreau in the 5th round? I don't know about the 5th round, Brian, but I think he would make a lot of sense. Foster Moreau is one of those guys like. He's a perfect Saint type player, but he would be a late round pick, I think.
5th is a late round. I'm thinking that he'll be gone by the 5th round.
Really, I didn't know his stock improved from.
Oh, I mean, his stock might have improved more than anyone at the combine.
Really,
him and probably DK Metcalf. I mean, Foster was top 5 in like 6 of the 7 athletic categories that they tested.
Yeah, I knew he tested well. I didn't know
he was dominant. I mean, on all the jumping, the running. I mean, he came out of there looking like a physical freak. And certainly, I mean, I didn't, think that highly of him. And certainly, the tape is obviously the number one thing. But, it's hard for LSU, non-running backs to have a lot of good opportunity to develop tape. So I think he's certainly a guy that, teams are going to see the potential, and he could be gone by the 5th round. But if he's there in the 5th round, I would definitely think that he would make sense as a guy the Saints pursue, except that he went to LSU.
Well, look, I've covered him throughout his career, and you couldn't get much better than him. He's a leader. He's a natural leader. I think he's been underutilized. I think he could have a better pro career than he did a college career, just from a stats perspective. He gets in the right offense, and yeah, there's a need there. And if there was that's a difficult position. We've talked about that on this show before. Learning the tight end position with the Saints is difficult for a rookie. Boston Rowe is one of the few guys I think could do it. I mean, he's really sharp. He's the kind of guy I think could come in and be professional and could contribute. But whether there's a fit or not, there's a lot of other teams that are going to be interested in him as well that have better draft assets than the Saints. So, does he fit? Yes. Will he be here? Who knows? It's a crapshoot.
For sure. Joshua Clay Livingston on Facebook writes, "We need a hard-hitting safety to shore up our secondary, someone in the middle of the field to make the wide receivers and QBs think twice. Is there any way for them to acquire such a player with the limitations they face with cap space and the draft?" Well, it might not even be about the limitations that they have. It's sort of the defense. That's not Dennis Allen's defense doesn't have that guy. I mean, Vaughn
Bell can hit you. I mean, Vaughn Bell.
No, he absolutely can. But I mean, Vaughn Bell spends so much time playing close to the line of scrimmage, whereas Marcus Williams plays so far back.
Right.
And that's just not a position that they have. They don't have the roamer who's just going to follow the ball.
But Caro did a little of that early in his career, but not as much.
Right, and that was before Dennis Allen.
Right, before Allen got there. And I would say this. I tend to disagree with your premise because in today's game, the hard-hitting safety is becoming an endangered species because of the rules changes. The old days of Jack Tatum and Ronnie Lott lighting up receivers are gone.
Right.
Yeah, there's almost that position has lost value because you're going to get flagged by the officials in that situation. I think the Saints are okay at safety right now. I don't think it's a huge need, except for maybe a veteran, cheap guy to come in and be a part of. We've talked about that before, and I don't know if they can afford a Matthew or Eric Weddle.
It really depends how much they're willing to spend on their special teams guys, because both Chris Banjo and Craig Robertson are free agents, and if they bring Banjo back, he could be a good third safety for you. And he's played a little bit. He would be on the field during 5 wide receiver sets last year. But I just think that in terms of most pressing needs, I don't think a backup safety, which is effectively anyone they would sign would be, is at the top of the list.
I would love them to see it go after Eric Weddle, just because I've been a fan of his throughout his career, and I think he fits really well with his team. But as Josh said earlier, he's not going to come cheap, and I think he's going to have a lot of suitors. He brings a lot to the table. He's a really smart guy, great leader in the locker room. A lot of teams are going to want an Eric Weddle type that probably have more assets, like we've been saying, that can offer to him. Now, what does he want at this stage of his career? I think he's going to want to win a ring. It wouldn't shock me, Josh, if he ended up back in L.A. with the Chargers.
Oh, yeah.
He's good friends with Phillip Rivers. He had a great career there. I don't think they left on bad terms. That could be a possible fit for him. He knows the organization. So,
who was the Bronco? I'm blanking on it. Darian Stewart.
Yes.
Broncos just cut him. I mean, that's a guy who I think could fit. He's getting up there in age, but if it all comes down to what these guys want. I mean, if you're a free agent safety and a team promises you the chance to start, you're going to go there
with the money.
Whereas the Saints just can't promise that unless for some reason they don't think Vaughn Bell or Marcus Williams are up to the task. But everything I've heard, suggests that's not the case.
All right, Robert Gallinghouse has a very good question about the Saints' supporting wide receiver cast. Beyond Mike Thomas, you've got Traquan Smith, Keith Kirkwood, and Ted Ginn Jr., Tommy Lee Lewis as well, I guess.
Austin Carr.
Yeah, Austin Carr. How do we assess that? I mean, I think it's pretty obvious. You have a developmental prospect still in Traquan Smith and Keith Kirkwood. I guess Austin Carr falls into that same mix, but they've got a bunch of guys there. They're all somewhat productive, but there's no real threat, I think, that scares opposing defenses opposite Mike Thomas, and it kind of played itself out. We saw it down the stretch. So many teams double-team Mike Thomas in third down, near the goal line, in the red zone, and it created some problems for the Saints scoring-wise. I think they need to find somebody there, but that's easier said than done.
Right, yeah. I think that they should definitely be in the market for another wide receiver. That's actually not a position that Sean Payton mentioned when we asked him about his needs at the Combine. But I just think they need one more playmaker. on offense, whether it's a receiver or a tight end or, you know, some type of shifty running back. I mean, I don't think that will be where they go, because I think it'll be more likely that, you know, they have Alvin Kamara and some number 2, whether it's Mark Ingram or someone else. But I think you need to bring on one more guy. I think, you know, like we said earlier, Adam Humphries would make a lot of sense to play in the slot. This actually is a really good wide receiver class, deep with speed, and we know how much Sean Payton values speed, and with Ted Ginn only having 1 year left, and even though Traquan Smith is pretty fast, I don't think he's that go-to deep threat. I think they sort of need to develop him into a more physical guy than a speed guy. So I think, you know, certainly they need somebody. I think Keith Kirkwood could be a pretty good player, but I just think that as you look to the future, when Drew Brees isn't around, you're going to need a much better supporting cast.
Yes.
And so, you know, this would be the time to try to take in a higher pedigree receiver and try to develop him, because so far, you know, we haven't seen enough from Traquan Smith to believe that he's definitely going to be that guy.
No, yeah, you've seen some flashes, some great potential, had some huge games, but also disappeared at times. Young guy, I think a lot to like there, but he's not a sure thing by any means. And Brandon, we answered this question earlier about Ted Ginn Jr.'s contract. He's got 1 year left. He's going to make $2.5 million base salary. So, you know, they could move on from him if they wanted, but I don't think they will. I see him probably making it through this year. But they need to find somebody. I mean, he was hurt last year. That's what starts to happen to these players. They get long in the tooth. Even a great athlete like Ted Ginn Jr., they just start breaking down. It's a violent game. So I don't think they feel comfortable counting on what they've got right now. But what can they afford? What can they get in free agency? I don't know.
That's what it all comes back to. And I hate, you know, to keep
on the saw again. You're sawing the sawdust, as Rick Ventura said.
Well, I mean, Boyd Linhart Jr. asked, which free agent safety should the Saints go after? I guess my question to you, and I will read the comments later, is why do you think the Saints need a safety so bad? I mean, everyone I know was just railing on Kurt Coleman the whole season, so cutting him certainly.
Railing. You primarily, I think.
So, no. I did no such thing. I got along great with Kurt. But I just don't know why they think there's such a pressing need. I mean, Marcus Williams obviously, you know, wasn't great last year, but he's going to be the starter.
Yeah.
And he's shown enough potential that, you know, if he can improve his tackling, he should be a pretty good player. And Vaughn Bell, I thought, was really good last year. Vaughn Bell was one of the keys to the run defense. You know, he's definitely flawed, but most players in the NFL are. And I think those two guys, you know, as long as your cornerbacks play well and your defensive line plays well, those guys can be your starting safeties for many years to come. I mean, Vaughn Bell is going into the last year of his deal, so that's one thing to consider. But, you know, when that's the case, typically you bring in a young guy, you know, to develop for the future if you're not going to re-sign him. So I just don't know that signing a safety to a deal that, you know, suggests he's the starter, which was Vaughn Bell in a curious situation where he has to wonder about his future, which is basically what happened with Kurt Coleman last year, is going to be the smartest thing to do.
Yeah, I think safety is, you know, Sean.
It's a luxury. It's a luxury.
Yeah, well, Sean has those lists. What is the priorities? It's a must, a need, and a want. Or I think it's down the list. It's not anywhere near a must.
Right.
And I think they would maybe like to have a veteran guy, but it's not a high priority for this team. Like I said, Kenton Urema asks about the Saints' defensive end position, and he talks about how young they are there. Kenton, I disagree. I mean, I don't think they're that young. Cam Jordan's a veteran. Alex Okafor. Now, they do have a couple of young prospects still, Marcus Davenport and Trey Hendrickson, who's kind of a swing guy right now. I think they're okay at defensive end, but, you know, they've got to get – Marcus Davenport has to develop.
Well, Okafor is not even under contract.
Right, I know. And he's not with this team. I think they'd like him back maybe, but you could move on from Alex Okafor and be fine with Davenport, assuming he's the kind of guy you could just kind of tell he's got talent, potential, but he was a developmental prospect when they drafted him. He came from Texas San Antonio. He was a wide receiver when he came to college. You can see it in his build. He needs lower body strength. He's got incredible athletic ability. He's a big guy. But, you know, he's going to need a year in the off-season program, and he could, you know, emerge. Defensive linemen in particular take a while sometimes to develop. Demarcus Lawrence wasn't a world beater when he came into the league, and now he's one of the better defensive ends in the league. Akeem Hicks with the Saints, certainly the first 2 or 3 years, they traded him for a blocking tight end, and now he's one of the best defensive tackles in the league. You have to be patient with these guys. So I could see them maybe addressing that position, but I know they like Hendrickson.
Yeah, I know they like Hendrickson, and obviously, you know, at some point they're going to have to, you know, have give Davenport the opportunity to cut it loose, and that's why I think there's certainly a chance Okafor might not be back last year as much as he wants to be, and as much as the Saints do need that depth. But
I could see him sign him like for a minimum deal.
Sure.
Because if he doesn't get anything else, and he might not.
I don't know. I think some team will pursue him.
You think so? Yeah. I mean, he's a good run defender. I would give him that.
Yeah, he's a good run defender. I mean, he had, I think, 4 or 5 sacks last year.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's not great, but, certainly,
he's fourth defensive end, you're okay.
He's more desirable on the market now than he was 2 years ago when he lost his starting job with the Cardinals and the Saints signed him.
Yeah, I'm with you on that.
And and as a player, you sort of have to strike when the iron's hot.
He's a total pro, great guy, would fit in any locker room. So, that reputation is going to serve him well in free agency. Last one, right? Boyd Leinart asks, what position do you guys think the Saints will use their first pick in the second round? He says, I'm thinking linebacker or offensive line. I don't think it'll be linebacker. I could see maybe offensive line. I think it's going to be the best player that's there.
Yeah, it has to be the best player available. I mean, I know we say that every year. That should be most teams' approach, unless you have a pressing need like a quarterback. That's really the one place that you would reach for a guy. But I think that when you have few picks, you sort of have to make them count. And every position on your team is going to be a need within 3 years. And we're always told not to judge a draft, until 3 years in. So, the guy they get in the second round, there's no guarantee that he's going to make an impact as a rookie. So I think that, you just have to get a guy with the highest ceiling and bring him in. But I wouldn't be surprised by a linebacker. I mean, you look at, Demario Davis, was good last year. Alex Anzalone was pretty good. A.J. Klein was better than I expected, but he's going in the last year of his deal. I mean, that's a position that they could definitely use some help, especially Manti Te'o's probably leaving in free agency. Right. Craig Robertson could be, a guy who leaves. So I'm not ruling out really any position except quarterback. I'd be surprised if they took a quarterback in the second round. My money would probably go on defensive tackle or tight end because I think those are probably 2 of the best and deepest positions in the draft, which lines up perfectly with their needs. But yeah, there's really not a position that would surprise me.
Here's what I think is going to happen, and this is the cop-out. It's the easy answer. They're going to take the best player that's there, that's high on their board, that's still there on the board. That's kind of what they do every year. They're going to have somebody that might be an upper second-round grade, or somebody I doubt they would have a first-round grade that would drop all the way to the bottom of the second round. There's going to be somebody that they feel like has great value at that spot, whatever position. The Saints could use help almost at every position. Mm-hmm. You could justify taking any position except probably quarterback. And that's who they're going to take. I mean, and I don't know if they'll move around. They don't really have a ton of draft capital to make a move because even moving it within the second round costs you some draft assets, and they don't really have. They have to trade a future draft pick. So it'd have to be somebody it'd have to be a situation like they had a few years ago with Alvin Kamara, where Alvin Kamara, they had a first-round grade on, and they traded to get him and moved around. They had to trade, what was a third-round pick or something?
They traded a second-round
pick to get him.
To get a third-round pick, yeah.
To get a third-round pick to get him. It's going to be something like that if they make a deal, somebody that they really think is dropped way too far, and they've just got to get him because it's too much value. But again, they're going to have to probably trade a future pick like they did that year to do it because they don't have any picks to trade. Right. I mean, there's just not much value to a fifth-round pick.
And there would be willing teams, that would take a deal like that. I mean, because there are a lot of teams that, are constantly forward-thinking, and they know that if they can get so basically,
Green Bay is a good example. They got the Saints' first-round pick.
Exactly, and pretty much the rule of thumb is that in order to acquire a pick in this year's draft, you have to send one that's a round better the following year. That's what happened with the Alvin Kamara thing. The Saints traded a second-round pick to get a third-round pick. So if the Saints are going to move up, they might have to trade, their current second-round pick and a third-round pick to move up in the second round. And if they do that, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised if it's a tight end, but that's a position that typically guys struggle as rookies. So it would be probably similar to the Demarcus Davenport thing where everyone gets excited, the Saints finally address their need, but then when the season actually starts, this guy might not be starting, and he might have a tough rookie curve, and then all of a sudden people are questioning it, and then we have to figure it out a couple years down the road.
All right, well look, let's wrap it up. Let's just make a point. All the speculation will end when we join you next week on the same very program, because free agents will have started. We'll have a lot more answers, a lot less speculation. things will start happening for the Saints and everybody else a week from today as free agency begins, and we start kind of the unofficial or the official start of the 2019 NFL season. For Josh Katzenstein, I'm Jeff Duncan. I want to thank you all for joining us and tuning in, and check out all our